Mr. Gething, there's just one point of detail I wanted to ask you about before moving to some other thematic issues. If we look at your witness statement, WITN 5665001, please, Shomek. And if we go to page 6, you set out in the top of the page your understanding of some of the differences between the national schemes. And I just wanted to ask you about what you say in the second sentence at the top of the page. Under WIBS, Hep C and or HIV do not have to be detailed on the death certificate as it does under the other schemes. Can you just assist us with this? What was the thinking behind the decision not to include a requirement that the condition or some aspect of the condition be identified on the death certificate?
My understanding, this is my recollection, is that once people have been diagnosed and they would then be in the scheme, the bereavement lump sum recognises that's almost certainly going to be a material contribution, whereas actually if you then get into the death certificate and the causes of it, you pretend to get confident around people wanting something on the death certificate for a different purpose. So it's really about not wanting to try to make people have to refight their ability to receive the bereavement payment. And again, it's the recognition of the lack of dignity and stress that might cause. But these are people we have already recognised are entitled under the schemes that are received other payments.
We can take that down, thank you, Shomek. I wanted to ask you next about two areas not covered by the scheme, either in Wales or in any of the other nations. The first is the position of those who were infected with hepatitis B in consequence of treatment with infected blood products or infected blood. Has the Welsh Government ever, to your knowledge, expressly considered the inclusion or exclusion of hepatitis B? In other words, has it ever been positively addressed by the Welsh Government?
I couldn't honestly tell it in the documents that I've seen a deliberate examination of hepatitis B, but that may have come up in the advice. So I don't want to say that that's never happened because I'd need to go through in detail in some of the documents.
Okay, but you've no recollection of giving consideration to it yourself expressly?
No, what I've done is to consider the current conditions that we provide for, and when we've inherited the schemes, this has been the scheme that we've had, and in trying to understand the difference between hepatitis B and hepatitis C and its impact and also the curative ability for it. So I can't honestly say that I specifically, in advice, recollect proactively considering hepatitis B.
This probably follows from what you've said then, but would this be right then? You're not then in a position to give us an explanation as to why hepatitis B might merit inclusion or merit exclusion from the scheme?
No, I couldn't honestly do that for you. I'd be making it up, which I don't think is a smart thing to do given the oath I've taken.
The second area that I wanted to ask you about is the question of bereavement payments. Now, again, we've looked at the various written statements that you have made in terms of making announcements about the scheme. I don't think we need to look at the underlying scheme documentation itself, but they're clear that the payments are for widows, widowers, civil partners, or partners of those who have died, and there is some provision for under 21 dependent children in full-time education. What's the justification for excluding from the financial support scheme wider family members, such as parents who lost a child or adult children whose parents have died?
It's really about the parameters of the scheme that we have. I know that there are ongoing discussions between officials in all governments about the extent of support payments. I think it does include a broader view on dependent children or otherwise. But this again comes back to the schemes that we've inherited, how we've then looked to revise those schemes, and the conversations we've had with families, and any extra category we provide, we would need to be able to fund, and to do that in a way that didn't simply skim money off other people. So it's difficult in the complicated system we've inherited, how we've tried to simplify that, and there isn't a deliberate judgment that has been made that dependent children or parents are somehow undeserving, but we're dealing with the schemes that we've had and the conversations we've had to date. So I don't want to try to invent and say there's been a specific turn our mind to and a positive decision to exclude other categories of affected.
If we leave aside financial constraints for a moment, so leave aside implications for budgeting, would you accept that there may be as great a moral case for making payments to the kinds of family members I've identified who suffered some of the greatest losses imaginable in terms of the death of a child, or as a child the death of a parent, that the moral case for making payments to them exists? Would you accept that?
Yes, I can see that. And if you look at this in the process you would in a legal claim, then you'd understand who's bringing the claim and on what basis. And here, of course, if you have a child who isn't married, next of kin, then what happens there? And I can understand the plain moral case that is made, and I wouldn't try to deny that case at all.
And as a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you a little more about the parity discussions in a moment, but was the question of widening the scope of those who were bereaved who might be eligible to receive payments, was that a feature of any of the parity discussions between the four nations that you're aware of?
I'm aware that officials are discussing the potential to widen the scope of people in the ongoing parity discussions. We've reached a conclusion on a range of areas, but there are others still to run through. And my understanding is that health officials are talking about those. That, of course, depends on financial choices also being made as well.
Now, I want to turn then in a little more detail to the discussions about parity. Can we look, first of all, just at a couple of materials which indicate what might be regarded as the importance of the issues that the question of parity gives rise to? So if we start with WITN 4506022, please, Seamus. We can see, and this is really just by way of example, there are references at various points in the documentation, but this is a December 2019 meeting of the WIBS governance group, which has representatives both from the scheme and ordinarily at least from the Welsh Government. And if we go to the bottom of the second page, we see under the heading Parity of Payments, we see a reference to CC, I think that's Catherine Cody, reading out a statement: as an interim step in advance of any recommendations in the Infected Blood Inquiry's final report, the governments of the four nations are working towards greater parity in financial and non-financial support across the UK schemes, taking account of local circumstances and beneficiaries' needs. And then top of the next page, we see MSW, and that I think is a reference to the scheme manager, highlighting the high amount of calls WIBS have received from beneficiaries regarding parity in payments. Is it your understanding that this has been a key concern and source of anxiety or indeed anger and frustration for beneficiaries, this issue of lack of parity?
Yes, the differing design and the levels of payments in the schemes is plainly a matter that is not just there in theory, but is there in very real terms as well. It's been raised directly with me by stakeholders in correspondence and in personal meetings at various times. And in fact, I think it's raised in terms of the psychological impact as well. There was correspondence on that point that I'm aware of. So yes, parity is a very real issue for people in every part of the UK. And obviously, given that there have been differences in the scheme in Wales with other parts of the UK, it's certainly been a matter that has been raised on a regular basis with us and other elected representatives too.
And you've referred to the psychological impact. There is a letter from Dr. Coffey, who's consultant clinical psychologist with the Welsh Infected Blood Support Scheme, to the Welsh Government recently, WITN 4506014. I don't have a specific question for you, Mr. Gething, arising out of this letter, but it is, I think, sufficiently important to warrant being referred to. So we'll see it's addressed to Ms Cody within the Welsh Government, 11th of March 2021. Dr. Coffey explains that she's a consultant clinical psychologist since December 2019, working clinically with beneficiaries of the Welsh scheme. There's been much discussion about the issues related to the lack of parity across the 4 devolved schemes. And this has been a significant feature in many of the consultations I have had with WIB's clients. I'm therefore bringing to your attention and the attention of ministers my observations about the significant psychological and not only financial impact this ongoing issue is having on WIB's clients. It is crucial that the context and impact of the decisions of a higher-powered organisation are seen as relevant and need consideration. There are similarities between the decisions of the governments now and the NHS then, which is a reminder of the harm, not help, that was inflicted upon the beneficiaries. Understandably, people report entrenched feelings of anger and injustice, alongside damaged identities related to feeling like a second-class citizen, as unworthy and undeserving due to a growing awareness that harm was knowingly inflicted on an unimportant group of people. The extent of the psychological injury is unquestionable. The acceptance and normalisation of the harm caused is only more recently being exposed and challenged, but the current legitimisation of the lack of parity is a highly sensitive reminder that again such people are targeted as less than causing secondary psychological injury. The inequality provokes reactivation and reliving of past traumatic experiences and can be perceived as confirmation that fairness is not required due to the second-class citizen status. Equality, just wait for the screen to catch up, equality and fairness would help to interrupt the trauma cycle and the associated symptoms, providing a platform for the complex journey towards adjustment and acceptance of situations of harm and injustice. Achieving parity would demonstrate the importance of recognising the need for fairness and justice. I have been struck by the resourcefulness and resilience shown by the beneficiaries of the scheme and surprised by the desire to move forward from such painful experiences. Realistically, the associated traumas will never be resolved, but it is psychologically damaging and limiting progress if aspects of inequality, in particular the lack of financial parity across the 4 devolved schemes, are not currently addressed. Now, that was a letter addressed by Dr. Coffey to the Welsh Government and for the attention of ministers. Do you, Mr. Gething, accept and acknowledge what Dr. Coffey sets out in that letter?
Yes, I understand completely why people are angry and frustrated, and the differing levels of payment do have a real impact on how people see themselves. And this question of value, and am I valued differently to other people in other parts of the UK who have all essentially suffered the same injury from the same failing on behalf of the state. So I do understand that. And it's why there's such frustration about the length of time it has taken to get to where we finally have got on having greater parity in terms of the financial settlement and provision for beneficiaries. It's also why there's a need to have that on a firmer and more long-term footing. So yes, I recognise that, and it's certainly not been for want of trying. We've not been able to land and get to the position that was only reached in March of this year. And this is just the reality of not having a consistent view, some change in ministers, but also about trying to get to the point where this isn't seen as it's up to every government to find its own money to do this, rather than actually recognise this as a UK-wide failing and have a UK-wide answer on how that financial parity is achieved. There's been stops and starts in the conversations between officials, and the engagement with Jackie Price-Doyle then led to a change only partly explained by the general election, and then some shift in the ministers who were responsible, and the eventual agreement to make some progress. And to be fair, the way that the current Cabinet Office Minister has pursued the matter, and that the 4 health ministers within each of the parts of the UK have rapidly come to agreement on parity in short order immediately before the elections in Wales and Scotland.
And I'm going to ask you I'm going to try and unpick a little of that and just look at a handful of documents that might cast some light or indeed give rise to some questions about the process. So if we just start with a 4-nation ministerial teleconference on parity that took place in July of 2019, it's WITN 5665003. And we can see the date there, 10th of July 2019, and we can see the attendees in terms of ministerial attendance. For England, Jackie Doyle-Price, the then Minister for Mental Health, Inequalities and Suicide Prevention. Julie Morgan for Wales, so the Deputy Minister for Health and Social Services at the time. Joe Fitzpatrick for Scotland, so the Ms Goujon's predecessor. And then Northern Ireland, as we heard yesterday, did not have a minister, so we have there attending the permanent secretaries at the Department of Health and Department of Finance in Northern Ireland. Now, just before we look at the detail of some of the discussions here, prior to July 2019, Mr Gething, to what extent, if at all, had the issue of parity been discussed, first of all, at a ministerial level between the 4 nations?
I'd had conversations with UK ministers on a range of things at this point in time. Most of those conversations were around Brexit. But I do think that I'd had a conversation with Jackie Doyle-Price about wanting to get to parity. This was the first time that all 4 governments were in the same place at the same time to talk about it. There had been regular conversations between officials about the need to try to get to a point where there was parity because of the regular correspondence and understandable lobbying to want to get a more normalised and regular position that delivered financial parity across the UK. But I think this is the first time that ministers from all the governments who had ministers at the time were in the same place together with the officials from the Northern Ireland Executive.
And then if we look below the heading discussion, we see it said that Jackie Doyle-Price provided some opening context to the discussion. Second bullet point, the Minister apologised to her counterparts in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland that she had been unable to give advance notice of the uplift in English scheme payments announced at the end of April. Were you ever given or have you ever received any understanding of why it was said that the Minister was unable to give advance notice of that change to the ministers in the other nations?
No. There's never been an explanation as to why that was unable to happen. I think it's more accurate to say it was a choice.
And then the next bullet point, going forward, the Minister would like to adopt a spirit of cooperation between the 4 nations, looking at options to achieve parity, whilst honouring their integrity as separate devolved schemes. As part of this, she emphasised that no one nation, and indeed no one beneficiary group, should be disadvantaged by future changes. And then we can see the position being set out by Julie Morgan in terms of Wales. The Minister explained that the Welsh Government had heard strong views from their infected and affected campaigners since the England uplift announcement, with calls for Wales to match these levels of financial support. The Minister went on to explain that the scheme in Wales is determined by the resources currently available, and that as such they do not feel it is possible to find an additional £3 million within their existing health budgets. We then have the position in Scotland being set out, and over the page Permanent Secretary at the Department of Finance setting up Northern Ireland's position. And then we can see there's a wider discussion under the heading Principles of Parity. It said there should be a general agreement that each nature should give due warning of changes. And then Mr Fitzpatrick emphasised that moving forward, important to consider the 4 schemes in their entirety. Ms Doyle-Price said she felt that 4 nations need to agree some shared principles for moving forward first, and that a conversation about funding can then take place around these. And then Mr Pengelly, who was the Northern Ireland Department of Health Permanent Secretary, said that the issue of what we mean by parity appears to need further examination, noting that parity of support does not necessarily mean equal financial payments across all 4 nations. Jackie Doyle-Price agreed with this, querying how best we describe the value of the non-monetary support provided across the 4 schemes. And then there's a discussion about holistic support, and Ms Morgan talks about the psychological support. Just pausing there. Actually, no, we'll just look at the rest and then I'll ask you the question, I think, rather than pausing there. Funding, bottom paragraph at the bottom of the page, reports Mr Fitzgerald saying Mr Fitzpatrick saying he felt there was a case for future funding to come from outside health budgets, suggesting that the Treasury could provide essential funding allocation, which could then be used by each administration to make scheme improvements. And then next page, second bullet point, it says, on Wales and Northern Ireland's request for central HMT funding for immediate payment uplifts, Jackie Doyle-Price responded that it was helpful to understand the strength of feeling on this particular matter. She did explain that she'd already had robust conversations with HMT about the recent uplift to the English scheme, and that the English Department of Health and Social Care had found funding for the uplift within their existing health budgets. Jackie Doyle-Price said that she was willing to communicate Wales and Northern Ireland's position to the centre at Westminster. So just to understand these discussions, we see, in so far as Wales is concerned, Ms Morgan saying we can't match the English payments because we don't have the money, and it would appear a request being made expressly or implicitly that funding for that should come from the Treasury. And was it your understanding that Ms Doyle-Price was effectively saying, well, I can pass that on, but don't hold your breath?
Yeah. She essentially said that she would make that position known as part of what at that point in time looked like some assurance from the UK Department for Health and Social Care that they wanted to find a way forward. But every time that there is extra funding found within existing health budgets, it does not always appear to be a real reflection of the position, and knowing that it causes additional pressure, particularly when, as in this case, we were uncited. But I didn't hold out a huge, I didn't accept this was a guarantee, but I did expect the UK government to act in good faith on this. And I think in a future budget or financial statement, there was an express reference made to money to increase infected blood payments in Northern Ireland by the then Chancellor, and I think that we wrote a further follow-up letter about that because the conversation about parity has moved in fits and starts through this period of time.
And we'll look at that letter in a moment. If we just go back to the full page, we see in bold print, in discussing next steps following this meeting, the following points were made. And then if we skip over the first 2 bullet points, we then get a passage which says the following key messages were agreed upon. The 4 nations are committed to achieving parity of support. Careful and further consideration must be given to what is meant by this, an acknowledgement that it does go beyond financial payments alone. As part of the above, the integrity of schemes developed under devolution must be respected, in recognition that the 4 schemes have evolved to address the particular needs of their beneficiary communities. In dialogue with those communities, in moving forward with this, no beneficiary of any country scheme will be made worse off financially, nor in terms of financial support. It might be said that whilst this meeting records at a very high level of generality a commitment to achieving parity of support, there doesn't appear to be any articulation or understanding of what parity might mean in practice. Is that right?
Yeah, look, I think that's fair, but that point about trying to make sure that no beneficiary group is left worse off by any agreement between the 4 nations on parity, it was important for us. And it's then about looking to how do you actually practically achieve that. So this is a starting point in having all governments in the same place at the same time, but certainly not an end of the road. And as we've seen, it took another couple of years to get somewhere meaningful.
And if we just go back to the previous page, please, Shomik, just want to go back to what Mr. Pengelly said. So bottom half of the page. We see there Mr. Pengelly noting that parity of support does not necessarily mean equal financial payments across all 4 nations. And Ms Dole-Price is recorded as agreeing with this. Now, in the eyes of beneficiaries, that might be said that parity of support means exactly that, equal financial payments across all 4 nations. What was the Welsh Government's approach to or understanding of parity at this time and subsequently?
Our understanding was that you could achieve parity either by having the same essential sums of money in terms of the overall sum, but that beneficiary groups may want to prioritise different areas of support, or alternatively you could have the same level of support in the same categories, and of course the additional support that we provided in terms of psychological support that is non-financial support. There's a cost of providing it, but that's non-financial support to that individual group of beneficiaries. But I think that in reality, our position was that we wanted to see, as far as possible, similar levels of payment, and we would want to see other parts of the UK recognise the progress we'd made on psychological support, because that had been proven to be generally useful and something that beneficiaries themselves had valued.
Now, that was July 2019. If we then turn to the letter you sent to one of the ministers in the Department of Health in October of that year, it's WITN 5665004. So it's from you and Julie Morgan. It refers to a letter from David Liddington to Jackie Dole-Price concerning parity, and then says this letter follows the meeting of UK ministers and a representative from Northern Ireland to discuss the issue of parity for those involved in our support schemes. At the meeting, it was agreed that your predecessor would work with Westminster colleagues to address the need for additional funds to allow for a first step in the parity issue. And is that a reference to the request that you or Ms Morgan had articulated for Jackie Dole-Price to raise Wales's need for funding with the Treasury?
Yes, and the softer indication that something might happen when, in fact, in that statement, nothing happened at all. Yes. I don't think it was referenced at all in the statement. There was in a subsequent statement by the Chancellor where, as I say, infected blood payments in Northern Ireland were specifically referenced.
Yes, and we looked at that, I think, in passing, at least with Mr Swan yesterday. But you say in the second paragraph, the statement made on the 4th of September by the Chancellor did not mention any additional funding for this issue in Wales. This was very disappointing given that this problem predates devolution, and the letter of the 23rd of July gave assurance that there would be consideration of an equitable share in funding to provide for parity across the 4 UK support schemes. We urge you, therefore, to reconsider the issue and provide the funding necessary to enable us to work towards parity in the support provided to those infected and or affected across the UK. Now, up until March of this year, and we'll come on to consider developments in March of this year in a moment, had there been any further progress in terms of securing any additional funding from the Treasury, from the Westminster Government?
No.
Had there been, again, up until March of this year, any further ministerial discussions that you can recall exploring further the issue of parity?
No, we'd raised it, and I know officials had raised it, but there hadn't been any genuine ministerial engagement on this at all. I certainly don't recall participating in any discussion around it, and I don't think Julie Morgan and my deputy had participated in further direct ministerial engagement, which is disappointing and frustrating.
And if we just move on then to June of 2020, we can see a letter sent by Ms Cody, who's the policy lead within the Welsh Government for this, WITN 4506012. So this is a letter to beneficiaries dated the 10th of June 2020. Second sentence of the first paragraph, I thought you would appreciate an update on the work we're currently undertaking to achieve parity of schemes across the UK. There's reference to a meeting that Julie Morgan had with the Chair of Haemophilia Wales and the Chair of the Senate's cross-party group. They discussed the growing pressure for Wales to match fund ex gratia scheme payments to reflect that paid to those on the English scheme. It's then said Vaughan, Gething and Mark Drayford have considered the proposals put forward, which have been costed, and unfortunately it's been agreed that Welsh Government are not in a position to fund the proposal at this time. So is it right to understand that there have been some fresh and active consideration by you and the First Minister of whether the money could be found?
Yes, and as we're going through the budget exercise, it was a specific ask from the support groups, and that's why there was a meeting with the cross-party group and Lynn Kelly and Judy Morgan. And Judy Morgan had been the previous chair of the cross-party group on this issue. I think she'd been active in this issue in her time as a member of the UK Parliament too. And we reached a position where we weren't able to find the money, given the budget position that the government and the health budget faced. And equally, what we had understood was going to be a genuine attempt to find parity across the UK. Officials were continuing to raise the issue and to want to talk about it, but as you see in the letter, we hadn't reached a conclusion by then, and it wasn't clear who had ministerial responsibility until Penny Mordaunt was identified as the relevant minister.
And we can see in the next paragraph, it refers to continuing to press the Treasury for necessary funding, as this is a UK government responsibility. And the work includes all areas of the 4 UK schemes. And then the Minister and Deputy Minister wrote to the then Minister of State for Care last October, reaffirming the funding case. That I think is a reference to the letter we've just looked at. Progress was held up by the UK general election and delay in confirming ministerial responsibilities. And then we see the reference to the Paymaster General Penny Mordaunt having initial discussions and proposing to take this forward. So prior to the involvement of the Paymaster General, it would appear from this that there'd been, to some extent, an element of vacuum in terms of decision making, that there was nothing happening from the UK government. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, so the conversations between officials hadn't made any progress. Then there was a general election, then there was a gap, and there was a vacuum without progress being made. And then Penny Mordaunt was identified as the relevant minister responsible for the infected blood inquiry. Although in the letter, you'll note that the agreement to convene a 4 health ministers meeting to take this forward, that didn't really happen. What did happen, though, was the reference made in, I think, paragraph 23 of my statement, and where a bid was nevertheless made in the summer of 2020 for the UK Treasury to help resolve the matter.
And we've looked over the last 2 days at a letter sent by the Paymaster General to the Chancellor of the Exchequer in September 2020, but you've helpfully exhibited to your witness statement an earlier letter, and if we'll just look at that, it's WITN 5665005. So this is a letter from Penny Mordaunt, Paymaster General, 13th of July 2020 to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. If we pick it up at the bottom of the page, financial support, she says in the second sentence of that first paragraph, ministers and the previous Prime Minister have committed to address disparities across the UK in the levels of financial support provided by the 4 devolved schemes. There's reference then to the previous Minister within the Cabinet Office having, and the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Health having met with campaigners and committed to a number of actions. This included resolving remaining disparities in financial support in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and addressing as far as possible broader issues of disparity, including support for bereaved partners. Beneficiaries in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are severely disadvantaged compared to beneficiaries in Scotland. Departments of Health across the 4 nations are costing the amounts needed to achieve parity for beneficiaries. We expect this work to be completed shortly. The resolution of these disparities is one of the main requests of the victims and their families, and my strong belief is that it would be the right thing to do. And then we can see then the reference to compensation for victims. It refers to Minister Dowden having written to the Prime Minister in January 2020. And then she says in the second paragraph, picking it up in the second line, I believe it to be inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. And then she goes to set out a number of thoughts in that regard. She says her officials are working with Department of Health and Social Care colleagues to consider approaches to compensation, any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. If we go to the next paragraph. Experience of other inquiries suggests that early action could save the government significant legal costs as well as provide victims with compensation as soon as possible. I believe the best arrangement would be to view this scheme as part of the NHS's existing compensation schemes, and she then says she would like to discuss the merits of doing this work with your officials as soon as possible. And then if we just look at the bottom paragraph, she explains she's copied this letter to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Health, and the Health Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, we can see there the reference to work being undertaken by the 4 departments of health to provide costings. And is this right? The Welsh government, through its officials, submitted an estimate of costings to the Cabinet Office in the summer of 2020 or thereabouts.
Yes, that's my understanding.
And then just for the sake of completeness, we'll look, although we've looked at it already this week, but obviously not with you, Mr. Gething, at the September 2020 follow-up letter from the Paymaster General, EIBS 40705. So this is 21st of September 2020. And if we just look a little further down the page, we can see she then refers under the heading financial support in the second paragraph to the costings that have been provided on the basis of costs over the following 5 years. If we go over the page, we can see in the last paragraph, the last written paragraph, she says, I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation. And would you agree, Mr. Gething, that action on financial support and compensation was long overdue?
Yes, and I think Penny Vaughan deserves some credit for setting out very clearly in that correspondence the need to act and her belief that it's the right thing to do so. I hope that clarity has helped us to move forward in the way that we have done, partially with Parity, but the next stage on the issues that she flags up in her letter, and also the handwritten notes at the end of the letter as well.
Now, if we then look at WITN 4506-023, this is a meeting of the WIBS Governance Group, 4th of March 2021. So it's now a number of months on from the Paymaster General's letter to the Chancellor. If we go to page 3...
Sorry, the note that I have up is the 7th of July 2020, not March 2021.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got the wrong reference. If you just give me a moment. Shemek, I think it's WITN 4506-023. My apologies. Sorry, 025. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Gething. This should be the right meeting. 4th of March 2021.
Yeah.
If we go to the third page, if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see a Welsh Government update. So this is as at early March, 4th of March. Ms Cody says she's continuing to work closely with the other 4 nations' health departments regarding parity. Ms Cody notified the group of Northern Ireland's decision to pay widow payments for members of their scheme until they pass away, and recognised that this would cause distress to WIBS beneficiaries. So that's, again, the early March announcement that Mr Swan told us about yesterday. And then Ms Cody refers to being in the process of briefing ministers and amending the direction. So is it right to understand that by this point in time, 4th of March 2021, the Welsh Government had heard nothing substantive further about funding or about how parity might be achieved?
That's correct. It all happened in a significant rush towards the end of March, so shortly after this meeting, in fact. And in some ways, I think that the Northern Ireland decision helped to crystallise matters and move things forward to get to the ultimate position that we're able to announce on the 26th of March, I think.
What can we'll look at your announcement of I think it's the 25th of March in a moment, but what can you recall of the events or discussions in which you participated or of which you were made aware in the course of March 2021?
So it was really, as my statement sets out in paragraph 24, it was raised in one of the regular meetings between the 4 cabinet health ministers across the UK. We'd been meeting on a regular basis throughout most of the pandemic. That would be myself, Jean Freeman in Scotland, Matt Hancock and Robin Swan. And it was raised in the 11th of March meeting that there might be a way to deliver progress and deliver broad parity. And there was agreement there that we'd want to do so. But myself and Jean Freeman made clear that we had elections and that our ability to make ministerial choices would be affected. And so there was a short window to achieve what we would all want to do. And that then happened very quickly. So officials had to work very quickly after that to get to the point where we could have a written statement. And I received a number of communications about what might or might not be in a written statement, what might not be in the parity agreement that was reached. And I then issued a written statement on the first day of the pre-election period, which is unusual. You'd normally have to make those ministerial choices the day before, but we would otherwise have been in the absurd position of Wales not being able to make a statement to set out for people that we have responsibility for how they were directly affected by the agreement that had been reached. So we did then make that statement on the first day of the pre-election period. It was a discrete matter where the same messages were being provided in each part of the UK, and I believe it was appropriate to do so.
And then if we look then at the statement that you made on the 25th of March 2021, it's WITN 5665006. You say this: I'm pleased to inform members of additional financial support for those infected with hepatitis C and or HIV via contaminated blood or blood products. Members will be aware that agreement was reached in principle between the 4 UK health departments to resolve disparities in July 2019. Since then, officials have worked with their counterparts and those in UK Cabinet Office to resolve these disparities. Today, UK Treasury has announced that they will fund a number of changes to the 4 UK schemes to work towards parity. This funding will be backdated to April 2019. For our beneficiaries who currently receive ex gratia payments delivered through our partners at WIBS, the scheme will be amended as follows. And then we can see set out 6 elements to the changes. Our regular annual ex gratia payments will be increased to the rates currently paid in England/Scotland. Payments for bereaved partners will be increased to 100% of the beneficiary's payment in year 1 and 75% in year 2 and subsequent years in line with the position in Scotland. All the above payments are to be backdated to April 2019. Then the next 2 bullet points deal with amendments to the lump sum payments. One to bring it in line with Scotland, backdated to April 2017. One to change in line with England and be backdated to April 2017. Winter fuel payments to be paid in addition from April 2021. And then if we go over the page, you refer to the bespoke psychological support scheme, and then you say we remain committed to working towards addressing disparities between the schemes, and we'll work with WIBS to communicate the changes to beneficiaries. Beneficiaries will continue to receive their current payments until the changes can be made. We anticipate they'll be able to make additional payments where required by the end of the calendar year, sooner if possible. I've also agreed with my fellow health ministers that any future changes to national schemes will be subject to consultation across the 4 administrations. Now, just I think a couple of questions of detail. If we go back to the previous page. The backdating of payments in terms of the regular annual payments for primary beneficiaries and the payments for bereaved partners is to be backdated to April 2019. Why was that date chosen, Mr. Gething? Are you able to assist with that?
understanding is that relates to when changes were made in England and to backdate to that point in time. And it's a conversation about levelling up to the level that each country was paying for each of the areas. And there's a line chosen about when the financial support is being made available to enable backdating to take place. And you'll have seen the costings that you ran through in a previous document to enable us to do so.
Now that's, I think, right in terms of there'd been an uplift to English payments in April 2019. In relation to payments for bereaved partners, the Scottish scheme predated April 2019. Do you... so maybe some disparities remain. Is there any proposal for officials of the health departments of the four nations to work together to try and identify whether there are any further disparities, and if so, what action to take? Or is this it now in terms of addressing disparity?
No, my understanding is that there is still some ongoing conversation around parity. We talked earlier about potential for dependent children, for example, so there are still some conversations that are still taking place between officials. And on the payments for bereaved partners, we need to understand whether the April 2019 backdating date actually makes a material difference, bearing in mind how recently the changes were made, whether the 3-year period that we previously announced would have been completed by then, so it may make no material difference. But on the broader issues about parity that you raised in our questions before the break, then yes, there are still conversations that are taking place between health departments, and of course the recommendation of this inquiry could well be material to those as well.
I've been asked to ask you if you're able to clarify again one point of detail in terms of the bereaved payments about the applicable rate. I'm going to ask you the question, Mr. Gething. If you're not able to answer it, then it's probably something we'll wish to follow up and ask someone within the Welsh Government to answer in writing. But the question I've been asked to raise with you is this. Will payments be based on an assumption, so these are the regular payments for bereaved partners, that the date of death and the applicable rate is the current rate, so it's 100% and then 75% thereafter of what their partner would have been entitled to as at the new rates? Or is it the 100% and then 75% of what the partner would have been entitled to as at the date he died?
I can't confirm that point directly now, so I don't want to give the wrong answer, but I'll happily make sure that we provide you with the correct answer in writing.
And then can I just ask why it might take until the end of this calendar year to be able to implement these changes? Are you still waiting for further confirmation from the Treasury as to the position, or is there some other reason why it might take a while to implement?
Well, it's about going through all the records to make sure that we do it properly. What we need from what we have from the Treasury is agreement on a year, and what we actually want is to be able to make these changes permanent, which is a different question, but it is about us. My understanding is be able to get all our records properly in place to be able to understand who we need to change payments with and for.
So your understanding is that the commitment you have from HM Treasury will just pay for 12 months funding of these changes and not any longer term?
I don't think we have a longer term commitment, and that's one of the things I think would be really helpful to resolve moving forward, and to have a clearly identified financial stream that is for this purpose. Otherwise, if this goes into the general health department budget without an obviously identified funding stream to do so, there is always a risk that pressure in other parts of the health department in any of the UK countries could lead to pressure on this scheme. Now, we know the hurt and the upset that has been caused to date. I don't think it would be sensible to then end up having a row between governments about whether the right amount of money has been passported from the Treasury to each of the 4 UK health departments. So clarity in the longer term commitment and clarity in the sums of money being passported over, I think would be to the benefit of beneficiaries, but all those people are then charged with making decisions as well.
We can take that down. Thank you, Seamus. The part of the announcement made by the Paymaster General on the 25th of March 2021 was about setting up or undertaking commissioning work in relation to a compensation framework. Is that something that you or your officials had prior notice of or any prior involvement in before the Paymaster General's announcement?
It certainly wasn't part of the conversation that I recall having with Health Minister on the 11th of March. Obviously, I welcome the fact that there is what looks like a serious attempt to address the issue of compensation, but it hasn't been the subject to any sort of ministerial conversation that I've been part of. I'd expect, though, in reality, that should be undertaken. It was going to be done by officials working with each other in the first instance, so it may be that's a matter for my successor in the health role, Irene Morgan, to address, but that does depend on how the compensation scheme is proposed to be set up.
And is it your expectation that the Welsh Government will have some involvement in or be consulted on the discussions and proposals and principles about a possible compensation framework?
Yes, I think it should be. And it's because the harm was caused before devolution, but actually the reality is it's harm that comes from the health service, which is now devolved, and people will expect whoever the relevant health minister is in each part of the UK to understand what's happening and not to say, I'm only the health minister, it's nothing to do with me, you need to ask someone else. Lots of people see that someone trying to pass the buck, and actually every health minister should understand what's happening. The best way to do that is to engage properly and meaningfully. I also think that it would mean we're much more likely to get a better designed scheme at the end of this to understand how we do properly address the issues of continuing concern.
And is it your expectation that funding for any compensation framework would come from the UK government?
Yes, that is my expectation what would happen. Otherwise, we'll just repeat all of the pain that has been caused by not having that clarity in the way that the schemes themselves have been designed up to this point for the support payment.
And do you share the Paymaster General's view as expressed in both her letters to the Chancellor of the Exchequer that it is inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation?
I agree, that is the right thing to do, and it is a matter of how rapidly the government moves to do the right thing. And that is the government of any shade, now and in the future. It is plainly a matter for the UK government to resolve.
So those are my questions for Mr. Gething. We do need to give call participants the opportunity to suggest any further questions, but I'm conscious also Mr. Gething has, I think, a significant meeting, which means he would wish to be away by 1:20. And so could we perhaps take 20 minutes now to enable any further questions to be suggested to me, and then resume at 1 o'clock, which should give sufficient time to complete Mr. Gething's evidence.
Yes, indeed. I think we'll take up every minute of your time until 1:20 probably, but not beyond. I hope. And we'll take a break now with that in mind until 1 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.